China's getting a little worried about the HIMARS. Now, one of the benefits of the war in Ukraine from a U.S. national security perspective is that we get to see how Russian equipment operates in a wartime environment. The downside of our sending equipment to that theater of operations is that Russia and now China are able to see how some U.S. systems operate as well. And one that has gotten Chinese attention as of late over the last few months has been the HIMARS. Now, as a former HIMARS battery commander back in like 2018, 19 timeframe, never thought this platform would get quite the attention it would on the international stage. I didn't want to go to a rocket unit. I thought I liked my time in light units. Rockets, it didn't seem like there was much there. It wasn't that much fun. But it's wild to see just how effective they have been against Russia in an active war zone. There's an article that came out in June 2023 that I just stumbled across recently, but I thought was worth sharing, titled "China Considers Countermeasures to U.S. HIMARS Missile System." And it talks about how Beijing is watching how these systems are being used against Russia, and they're trying to figure out what the heck they're going to do when they come up against it. It says Chinese media coverage of the war in Ukraine has been extensive. The close nature of the China-Russia quasi-alliance means that Chinese military analysts have not engaged in the ruthless critiques of Russian military performance that have been commonplace in the West. Yet Chinese military analysts are still probing deeply for lessons to understand the shape of modern warfare. They've taken particular interest in the U.S. employment of novel weapons and strategies. Now, the HIMARS isn't new, which has been an interesting thing from the start here. It's been around for 20 plus years by the time it entered the conflict here. And really the only thing new about the HIMARS is that it was a wheeled vehicle with one rocket pod on the back instead of the two pods we had on the tracked M270 MLRS. So like the rocket technology was there and that was from the 70s. And the only big thing is now we've got this HIMARS. It's a little more mobile, a little faster, easier to hide, things like that. But the actual munition type, the rocket launcher, like that's, it's improved over time, but it's not the newest of technologies, if you will. So the article gets into some kind of Chinese think tank articles talking about what they're going to do when it comes to the HIMARS platform. And it's worth noting that these think tanks inside of China are very heavily intertwined with their military, more than it is in the United States, which is saying something, right? So we can look at some of these articles, the analysis coming out of these articles as kind of the assessment from the Chinese military, at least the amount that can be publicly facing. They say, quote, "The HIMARS imported from the U.S. frequently attacked ammunition depots, logistics centers, and command posts in the Russian rear and have had a definite impact on the battlefield situation." Nothing, shocking there. I think that's how we all saw the HIMARS play out, especially in the first few months when they arrived in theater. They add that the HIMARS has the characteristics of being highly efficient for conventional combat as well as guerrilla warfare. Something we haven't really seen play out in the war in Ukraine. I think it's fairly accurate, so long as a force can maintain the ability to detect targets and receive some level of ammunition. It's a pretty effective system for that, if you think about it, right? One of the challenges the Russians had is finding and destroying these over time. HIMARS can be dispersed over a wide area and can conduct precision strikes at a long distance away in some sort of guerrilla campaign. Could still play out. I think all too often we think of guerrilla warfare as just being RPGs and AK-47s. It's not crazy that something like a HIMARS could be effective for a period of time, right? I don't know that would be a long-term solution. They say, according to the tactical situation of Taiwan's geography, the HIMARS will be mainly deployed in the Western Plains and in pre-designated positions. So real quick, Taiwan does not have HIMARS. The sale to Taiwan of, I think, 11 or 18 platforms has been approved. They're set to get there in the next few years, so they don't have them now, but China's looking at that, recognizing that this is going to be a threat that they're going to have to face. They say HIMARS will be mainly used to attack the landing forces and strike rear command and control sites and damage logistics. The furthest range of HIMARS can cover up to 300 kilometers inland of China. That's one of the longer range variants for the HIMARS. I guess they're looking at this assuming that the U.S. will give Taiwan kind of everything that they might desire. That's longer range than anything we've given Ukraine. So interesting that they're potentially viewing their conflict in a different light. And I guess that to be safe, that's probably what they should do, right? You wouldn't want to assume the other side, assume that it's going to be a shorter range munition, they can range longer. But it is interesting that they're looking at the use not just on Taiwan, but how the weapon systems on Taiwan could be used. U.S. weapon systems on Taiwan, right? sold to Taiwan. So these aren't U.S. forces, but being used to target infrastructure and logistics sites inside of mainland China. That's been one of the major concerns in the war between Ukraine and Russia, right? Is any Western equipment being used to strike inside of Russia is a big no-no and could escalate the war. It's interesting that China, again, to be fair, they need to plan for that. It doesn't look like they expect that same, line in the sand should they invade Taiwan. They talk about how HIMARS could be used before an invasion actually kicks off, saying this would be during a period when Chinese forces might be more vulnerable to attack as they're being mobilized to embarkation points along the coast. This assumption anticipates that Taiwan would receive the longer-range HIMARS munitions, which are capable of hitting targets in China. Again, I think this is a really interesting aspect here, and it's a step further than just striking inside of China. They're wondering what it would look like and how they can prepare against the idea that Taiwan would attack their embarkation points as they're preparing to launch an invasion of Taiwan, right? So the first round hasn't been fired kind of thing. Taiwan sees them massing for an invasion and kicks off the attack. I don't think that's very likely. Maybe after the first phase of the war or after it's clear that something is kicked off. But I have a hard time believing that Taiwan would carry out the first strike in this war. Maybe China eggs them on or something like that, but it's hard to see a scenario where Taiwan, before the first bullet is flown, launches a HIMARS strike against, a dock in mainland China where troops are loading to cross the strait. They say to destroy HIMARS, active attacks are one method. Air supremacy is to be promptly established and based on the strategy of active attacks. The emphasis on establishing air supremacy is a key insight taken from observations of Russian combat deficiencies in Ukraine. Chinese strategists seem reasonably confident in China's ability to establish air supremacy over and around Taiwan in the event of the conflict. Air supremacy is like what the U.S. had in Iraq and Afghanistan. Zero threat. I don't know if that ends up being a translation issue here or not, but like these little words actually have a big difference. Air superiority means that there still is an enemy threat there, be it surface to air, air to air. Air supremacy is you got complete and total control of the skies. That seems like a big ask for China to get complete air supremacy in a very short period of time. But it's understandable that looking at how things played out in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that China has moved that to the forefront of the priorities, right? Above all, air superiority, air supremacy. They say the Russians have deployed a large number of drones and other forces to carry out three-dimensional reconnaissance, locate the Ukrainian HIMARS, understand their movements, and launch fighter bombers to execute targeted strikes. Yep, it doesn't appear to have been effective. Again, we're sitting here, over a year after the first HIMARS launchers have arrived in theater, and not one has been destroyed that I've seen, right? So the way that Russia is going about doing this makes sense, but it hasn't necessarily produced the results, which is, I think, something China's going to have to reckon with, right? There's not a clear answer as to how to eliminate this threat on the battlefield. They say as Taiwan is approximately 17 times smaller than Ukraine, and China has likely spent decades mapping out the entirety of the island, there may be fewer areas to hide and less room for HIMARS to maneuver. Thus, China may feel confident that it can employ drones to conduct close-range reconnaissance and strikes, making it impossible for HIMARS to escape. It's definitely a different challenge than they're facing in Ukraine. There is so much land in Ukraine for these HIMARS to move around and to sit in a hide site 50 kilometers behind the front and then move out 30 kilometers north and fire from that firing point for one time ever and then move to a new hide location, never to be seen again. There's just not that amount of space on Taiwan. And once one of these gets spotted, you might find one of the only handful of hide sites on that side of the island. So definitely a different challenge for Taiwan. They add defensive steps were also identified as being important. China can utilize means of active defense, including jamming guided munitions and enhancing our air defense capabilities to achieve the effective intercept of guided munitions. The jamming piece, I think, hasn't gotten as much attention in Russia or in the war in Ukraine as it probably should have. There was a period of time a few months ago where Russia seemed to really be doing a good job at jamming. Remember, these HIMARS munitions are GPS guided, so you can jam that signal. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it is possible, at which point they become generally a dumb munition. They can't guide themselves back onto target. They can still be accurate and can still be fired, but the accuracy is reduced. Russia did a fairly decent job just at the start, I think just before the start of the counteroffensive, where they were jamming a fair amount of these HIMARS strikes. But that seems to have changed. That is a capability that is very close held on the battlefield. So understanding exactly what's going on with electronic warfare is not something you're going to find easily in open source information, but it's something that is kind of come in waves throughout the war. They say methods can be adopted to interfere with local information detection, acquisition, decision-making, and other processes. Or China could directly destroy enemy observation equipment, causing HIMARS to lose accurate targeting information. That's the first part of this. Even if you have the ability to strike anything in the world, you have to be able to identify the target. So, if you're looking at whether it's a radar system, counter-battery radar, that is picking up on artillery platforms firing and then being plugged into a launcher for target acquisition. It can be the destruction of drones, aircraft, anything like that. But the reduction of Taiwan's ability to identify targets is kind of the first step in that process, right? If you can't identify a target, you can't strike the target. They say there's additional awareness that Ukraine has benefited from receiving targeting data from the United States. Rather logically, this Chinese analysis assumed that Taiwan would also receive this intelligence. I think that's a fair assessment. And that's how a lot of this has happened. Now, the HIMARS, one of the things that I feel like this isn't brought up enough, the way GPS munitions work is you plug in a coordinate on the ground, right? So you don't want that to move. It becomes very, very hard. If you're trying to target a tank moving down a road, you have to guess. And there's all sorts of crazy calculations to guess where it's going to be after the time of flight and the processing time for the fire mission and all these different things. You generally don't use GPS munitions for that. You use GPS-guided munitions like the HIMARS for fixed targets. So if it's a command post and the command post, you saw it this morning, it's still going to be there this afternoon, right? Or a logistics hub or a munitions factory or something like those aren't moving in a few hours. So that tends to be, you can identify those with satellite imagery, which is, I think, one of the ways that the United States has really assisted Ukraine in this war is through satellite imagery, able to identify targets that Ukraine can then plug into their launchers and attack relatively easily. So recognizing that same thing is probably going to come from the United States in the event of a war with China, with a war between Taiwan and China, I think is pretty accurate. Kind of wrapping up, they say it's important to realize that Taiwan has not received any shipment of these weapons, and they may not arrive to the island until 2026. So, it's just last week where the most Chinese aircraft flew down the Strait of Taiwan in the last 3 years or something, right? So it's constantly a concern that this potential invasion could kick off. 3 years is a long ways down the road. We'll see if the HIMARS actually get there before anything like this actually happens. They say Western analysts may view HIMARS as a potential asset to increase deterrence, but Chinese military analysts are already expressing confidence in their ability to counter this weapon system through establishing air superiority, information dominance, drone attacks, and active defensive measures, such as jamming the guidance systems, as well as intelligence support systems. Look, the HIMARS is not like a miracle platform, right? The rockets can be acquired and shot down. The launchers can be identified and destroyed. Just how it is. It's the nature of war, right? None of these systems, none of these platforms are perfect. If China were able to establish air superiority in a short period of time, it would significantly reduce the effectiveness of HIMARS. I mean, you've seen these things launch, right? The smoke trails they leave in the sky after they fire makes for an easy target if there's aircraft overhead, right? You just can easily see where it came from, track it down, destroy the launcher. What China is bringing up in this brief, how they would deal with HIMARS, it's kind of common sense. It's nothing unique. None of this is a secret either. None of this was a secret to Russia. They just, for some reason, haven't been able to necessarily dial in all of these measures. But I thought it was interesting that this one platform is getting the attention of China as they look towards a potential future war with Taiwan. But that's all I got for now. If interested, check out the national security sit reps I put out on Substack. It's 7 to 10 of the biggest national security stories that week, along with a few podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.